we've definitely seen a lot more pushback from public schools and from just agencies in general. Homeschooling has been a fringe type of education for so long that to see these students now leaving and getting different types of education has thrown a wrench into a lot of traditional systems of schooling and education. And as a result, we've seen in the media, we've seen in different state houses, more attempts to regulate homeschooling and to bring it into the box that they know. Instead of the way homeschooling can be tailored to each individual, there is an approach of we need to make sure it all looks the same and sounds the same and basically is public school at home so that we can recreate what we know.
Welcome to Homeschool Talks, a podcast by HSLDA. This is a show about all things homeschooling, from practical tips to inspiring stories and everything in between. You can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes as well as upcoming guests and topics, sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. We're so glad you've joined us today, and we hope you enjoyed the program. Here's your host, Jim Mason.
Hi, I'm Jim Mason, President of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and this is another episode of Homeschool Talks. Today, I'm being joined by HSLDA Staff Attorney Amy Buchmeyer, and we're going to be talking about some things that she's worked on lately and some bigger picture things that are happening around the country regarding homeschool freedom. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you so much for having me.
Amy, before we start, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am a homeschool graduate. I was homeschooled kindergarten through senior year in Wisconsin. I went to Bryan College in Tennessee on my undergrad and the University of Wisconsin for law school, and graduated law school in 2020, right as homeschooling was taking off across the country, and was hired to work here as a staff attorney. So this has been truly a dream job. I wanted to work at HSLDA from a young age. If you read my journal, it says, I wonder what kind of degrees HSLDA attorneys got before they went to work at HSLDA. And then that I get to work here is still something I pinch myself.
So what is it that you do for us here?
So I am one of the staff attorneys. I have about 8 states that I monitor. I'm part of the teams that check any legislation going through, that looks at the cases that come in. So when a family reaches out with questions about how to get started homeschooling, or if they're running into any issues with their local school districts, I'm their first line of defense. Last
year was a pretty monumental year for you. Tell us about what happened in Ohio, and you can tell the whole story because it was a roller coaster ride, ups and downs.
It was. So the year, that would have been about 2022, we had whispers that the governor's office was looking to reach out to homeschoolers because homeschoolers were not happy with a certain bill that had been going through. And they said, well, what would homeschoolers like? And we pointed out that the regulations that were governing homeschoolers were all the way back in the 1980s when they came out. And as a result, you had lots of different approaches to how they were applying the homeschool law. It was different districts would have different requirements, and families were just always running into conflicts that weren't necessary because usually they were just little paperwork issues. Well, fast forward then to this point when the governor's office reached out and said, as we're working on this legislation, what can we do to help? We came back with, all right, let's modernize it.
So let me just point out something you just said that's, I think, really, really interesting. Homeschooling in Ohio circa 1978 was probably viewed to be pretty much completely illegal. And then there was a statute that seemed to give homeschoolers a little bit of a crack for how you could homeschool. And then, sometime in prehistoric times before the internet or email were invented, what happened?
The Department of Education got involved and wrote a bunch of regulations that said, yes, you can homeschool, but if you're going to homeschool, you need to have a curriculum list, you need to provide assessments, you need to let us know what textbooks you're using, and you need to submit all this information to your local superintendent, and you're going to get a letter of excuse back saying, yes, you're excused from compulsory school attendance.
And so that was the regulation that's been in existence since the 80s.
Correct.
Until recently, and it was creating a lot of upset and disproportionate enforcement all across the state, especially in one county whose name we won't mention. But tell us about that county, because as I recall, there were very consistent and really persnickety kind of conflicts going on there.
Yes. So one of the things this unnamed county was always wanting was a birth certificate for children whose names were different than their mother's name.
Was that required by the regulation?
It was not. You're not required to submit any birth certificate. There is a lot of information you're providing about your child, but that was not one of the things. You're just providing your child's name. And what they were looking for was confirmation that this was actually the parent homeschooling. Well, in most cases, these were family situations where the parents hadn't gotten married, or maybe they divorced, or mom had a new spouse. And so it was situations that were already interesting societally and complicated. And then you threw in this wrench of a school district saying, we're going to hold your child truant unless you prove that this is your child. And it just caused all kinds of stress for those families that wasn't necessary and wasn't required by law.
And as I recall, they were particularly picky about how parents, so the information parents submitted about what they were doing for their homeschool program would have been accepted in every other county in Ohio, except for this one.
Yes, it was truly same situation, same mom, same kid. You put them anywhere else in Ohio, and this doesn't come up as an issue.
So along comes the governor in 2022, and what is he?
Yes.
What happens next?
So the governor's office came, and they said, what can we do to help modernize the homeschool bill? And so we came back with the parent's name, the child's name, and the required subjects, an assurance that they'll be teaching the required subjects. You put that in a notice of intent, and you send it in once a year. It's clean. It lets them know where the child is, who's in charge of the child's education, and we made it an exemption. So the parent submits that notice, and instead of waiting for the school district to get back to them with an excuse letter or any of those other hoops, it's a notice that we're going to be homeschooling. That's not requiring anything else. They are supposed to get a receipt back, basically, from the superintendent saying, yep, I've got this, so there's no confusion about what happened. But really, it was an updated law that looked like most laws across the country.
And that just sailed right through, right?
Nope. So it ended up in a late night session in December. I drove across Ohio to testify, and at the very last minute, it was like 2, 3 in the morning, the whole bill died. But what that did is it started bringing conversation to what Ohio's law looked like and how Ohio's law was pretty outdated, and how this is something that back in the 80s when there was lots of suspicion about homeschoolers, that was the kind of law that they had in place. But that's not something that's needed in the 21st century, where homeschooling is much more mainstream and people are much more familiar with it. So because those conversations had started, we approached a state representative, Sarah Fowler Arthur, about bringing a bill, and she put it together, and it was basically very similar to the bill that we'd had suggested back in December.
Now, what connection to homeschooling did she have?
Yes, so Sarah Fowler Arthur is a homeschool graduate. She actually served on the Board of Education, and she currently is a representative, like I mentioned, but a homeschooling mom as well.
So she's a second-generation homeschool mom who sits on the legislature, and she sponsored the bill.
Yes.
And how did it work in 2023?
Initially, it just sat there. It was not going anywhere. So the bill was introduced, and it seemed to be going forward. And then right about March, a story came out about a family in Ohio that was using, that was at least on a website that taught Nazi curriculum. And so big deal, really awful thing, and caused a lot of concern.
So just for the record, we at HSLDA don't support Nazi homeschool curriculum.
Correct. That was not okay. But it looked like this one family's bad action was going to really ruin it for a whole lot of homeschoolers in Ohio, this good law we were trying to push through. And so there was a lot of confusion. But our allies at the Christian Home Educators of Ohio, namely Melanie Isley, is their legislative liaison. And she had lots of conversations with the legislators talking through why this is a good bill and why this one family's bad actions should not impact all of the homeschoolers in Ohio. And so because of those conversations and because a lot of homeschoolers reached out to their legislators and showed, we are homeschooling responsibly, we did get them the bill added to a larger bill that was going forward. And that ended up passing on July 4th of 2023.
And you mentioned that you came to work at HSLDA right in the midst of COVID. And so you grew up being homeschooled, and you went through law school, graduating in the middle of COVID, and you came to work here just as COVID was really picking up. Mm-hmm. What have you seen in homeschool world since you've been working here?
Definitely a growth in homeschooling. Obviously, that's the big one. And I think when I first started, I heard lots of versions of, but it's going to drop. We're excited for now, but we'll see how high this stays. And what I've seen is consistency. A lot of families started homeschooling because, the online schools weren't working for their student. And they realized my child is thriving. I can give them this one-on-one attention, and I can give them this unique education that they're going to really grow in. And so we've seen the homeschool numbers stay high and continue to expand to a lot of other families too, as they're realizing this is something we can do.
And has that created any new challenges for you as someone who talks to homeschooling families all over the country?
Well, we certainly have more members and more people reaching out with questions. A lot of it is families saying, all right, how do I do this? How do I get started? What paperwork do I need to send in? And reminding them you only have to send in what the law requires. So for example, in Ohio, as this year we've rolled out, the new law came out, actually didn't go into effect until November, which caused a wrench in everything. But reminding families now that we're going into a new school year, you don't need to submit assessments. You don't need to submit curriculum information. And this is a freedom that they have and they need to take advantage of. That we can give them that assurance and also provide them with the forms that say this is exactly what we need to provide. Don't worry about what the school system is sending you. We can help you out with this.
Do you find that newer families today maybe don't know the history of homeschooling and are kind of unaware that there are laws that actually apply?
Those do crop up, or I heard from someone that there's something I'm supposed to be doing, and so we get a mix. We have some families that are very concerned. They want to make sure they're 100% in compliance, and that's fantastic. We can walk them through it. And then for the families who are a little bit like, I don't even know where to start, we have a nice website that they can go to.
Where would that be?
HSLDA.org.
And I think you can look up your state's laws for each of the 50 states and a couple of territories in Puerto Rico.
Yep, and you can read them in Spanish too.
What other things have you noticed since COVID has abated and more students are leaving the public schools to homeschool?
We've definitely seen a lot more pushback from public schools and from just agencies in general. Homeschooling has been a fringe type of education for so long that to see these students now leaving and getting different types of education has thrown a wrench into a lot of traditional systems of schooling and education. And as a result, we've seen in the media, we've seen in different state houses, more attempts to regulate homeschooling and to bring it into the box that they know, instead of the way homeschooling can be tailored to each individual. There is an approach of we need to make sure it all looks the same and sounds the same and basically is public school at home so that we can recreate what we know.
How much do you think that is caused by during COVID, everybody homeschooled in one form or another. And it seems to me, anyway, that lots of parents who maybe wouldn't have considered homeschooling would have thought that they could never do homeschooling. Everything's changed because during COVID, parents and children were at home together a lot more than they had been in the past. And parents, really learned that, hey, I could do this. So even though some of them went back to public schools, it is easier now today for them to think about, I could go back and do that. And the public schools today are, challenged because, that is just easier and easier for people to imagine themselves homeschooling. And especially, why do you think most parents start homeschooling today?
A lot of them, especially if they're coming from the public school, start off saying, we tried. We jumped through the hoops to get the IEP. We, tried to address the bullying issue with our child, whatever the case might be. And then when they bring their child home and are able to give their child that one-on-one attention and say, oh, this is my child's strengths and weaknesses. This is how they learn. And especially when comparing to when I was homeschooled, there's so many more curriculums and opportunities. And if you need a math curriculum that will help your child, there are hundreds out there. And so part of what makes homeschooling today so much easier, I don't mean that that's easier to homeschool, because educating a child is still a challenge, but there are so many resources available. And now that they've tried it and they know I can do this, it just gives them a sense of, I know my child and I can provide that education that my child needs.
So my wife and I, shortly after we got married, decided that we would homeschool our kids pretty much throughout. Now I was a little bit more of a, we'll try this out and see how it works. And she was definitely in this is what I want to do for my kids. She wanted to be able to transmit her faith to the kids. And she was herself a public school teacher, and she didn't want her kids to be going to the public schools. And then I became a real committed homeschooler when my oldest child was about 3.5 years old. And we went to a class called The Writing Road to Reading, where they taught us how to teach your child to read, which unlocks all the doors for further education. What was your family like? Did your parents want to homeschool forever and homeschool you kids right through?
They somewhat similarly had both the reaction of we want to provide a Christian education to our kids, and then also reaction to their own education. So my dad was public school student all the way through, was in special ed classes pretty early on, and never really felt like he got past that title. He had a label stuck on him, and so he was constantly trying to overcome that. My mom, on the other hand, private school all the way through, straight A kid, but she would tell you she learned how to take tests. So she was really good at learning the knowledge, spitting it out, and moving on, and didn't learn to just love learning, didn't learn to just appreciate it. And so their goal was both to make sure their kids, even if they were struggling, weren't stuck with a label and felt like they couldn't get through it, but also to learn to just appreciate learning. So we used a very literature-based curriculum, and my mom's goal was always, I want you to enjoy it and continue to learn once you've graduated.
Mm. So there are still a lot of people who come to homeschooling that way, determined to homeschool right from the outset and throughout. And then you mentioned that especially since COVID, there are a lot of parents coming into homeschooling from the public schools. What kind of other challenges has that created for the homeschooling movement writ large?
There's the challenge of making sure that we are reaching out to them, because just because they didn't start homeschooling or think I'm going to homeschool all the way through, my child's graduation of high school, doesn't mean that they aren't on the path with us. And so making sure that we are approaching them with, yes, you're trying it out to see if this works. We're going to help you figure out what curriculum you need, what your child needs, and help you thrive while you're on this journey with us. I think has been not a huge shift, but it's definitely a different mentality than we've previously seen. I remember one of the first calls I got here was with a brand new on the job Montana member reached out and said, I'm hearing what my child is learning in the other room. He's not learning anything. What do I need to do to get him in a better place? And it was just connecting them. Okay, we're going to make sure you file your notice of intent. We're going to make sure you figure out what needs to be sent to the superintendent and if you need to do assessments and whatnot. But it was also just encouraging him and empowering him that he could see this isn't working. Yes, we can make this work.
So since COVID, and there was this big flood of public school kids out into homeschooling, a lot of them stayed. And then the culture in the public schools has remained challenging for a lot of families. And now that more families know that they can homeschool if they want to because of their experience in COVID times, it has appeared to me that there have been a lot more media stories that seem to be looking at homeschooling with a very jaundiced eye. What can you tell us about that?
Well, the big names, obviously, like the Washington Post over the last few, starting mostly last year, but even into the beginning of 2024.
Well, what did the Washington Post do?
So the Washington Post wrote a series of articles basically critiquing homeschooling. A lot of them were with either graduates who were dissatisfied with their education or saying, this powerful lobby keeps deregulating homeschooling. And the tone was not super positive for homeschooling.
They did put a nice picture of me in the Washington Post, for whatever that's worth. I don't know that they were big fans of me, but they did put my picture in.
They got your good angle.
So what other news stories have come out, or productions, I guess? Sure.
So you've also seen, homeschooling ended up getting tied in with things like the Shiny Happy People documentary. You see it in calls from state officials that are trying to tie homeschooling to different high-profile media stories.
And when you compare that to kids in public school who face an entirely different kind of challenge, bullying and violence and all kinds of exposure to things that aren't really healthy for kids. Public schools are probably a lot worse for kids when you take into account all of those things. And yet, these stories tend to focus on a really rare but horrible case as an example to reach their goal of, more severely regulating homeschooling, and even some who have called to ban homeschooling outright. Were you here yet when Elizabeth Bartholet started her role in the Harvard Crimson and the Arizona Law Review article?
I think I came about 2 months later, or just a few months later.
But you know who Elizabeth Bartholet is. So Elizabeth Bartholet wrote a Law Review article that was profiled. So the Law Review article was kind of a funny deal. I knew about the existence of the Law Review article for months before it was actually published, because those kinds of scholarly articles are often posted, and as drafts, and then they get updates and revised, and people can comment on them before they get finally published. But then it was finalized, and in April of 2020, which is a very important month to remember, the Harvard Crimson magazine profiled Elizabeth Bartlett's law review article in which she called for a ban of homeschooling. And the Crimson magazine article about this was also titled, Harvard professor calls for a ban of homeschooling. And that article, so it went viral. And the popular article by the magazine went viral, even though I think the law review article, which had been out and kind of known to people like me for months, may not have. And I found out about the article. So this was mid-April. Things were just starting to shut down, including like the Stanley Cup playoffs, which was just horrible. Not to make light, but that was one of the worst things. And I was heading upstairs to bed, and my youngest daughter, who was about 17 at the time, has her phone. And as I get to the top of the stairs, she says, "Dad, did you see this?" And she thrusts it into my face. "Do you even believe this?" And it's Elizabeth Bartlett calls on a ban homeschooling. And that just started a whole thing. I mean, when you think about it, the articles that came out post-COVID have not called for a ban of homeschooling. They have been really focused on telling long-form stories and high production values and sounding like they're just asking for some reasonable regulations. But it all started, really, back with Elizabeth Bartlett calling for a ban based on a kind of clash of worldviews. So Elizabeth Bartlett doesn't like homeschooling, not so much because kids, aren't being educated as much as she thinks that most homeschoolers are kind of a bunch of backward clods who are overly religious and can't really be trusted. And so then, COVID hits and everybody's homeschooling. The whole world's homeschooling the day after Elizabeth Bartlett's article comes out. It was bad timing for her. But then, the tides of COVID recede, kids get back into public school. And then we start seeing all of these articles coming out from the same kind of media outlets. And they're all sort of focused on this idea that we really can't trust these homeschooling parents. They really need to be brought to heel. We really need to regulate them. And so that's a big focus of our work here. It's twofold, really. To make sure that people understand that homeschooling is a really good educational opportunity. It's a good lifestyle for families if you really put yourself into it. And then also to push back against these false pictures. What have you been doing to help with that work?
All of us staff attorneys are available for talking with the media, for writing outputs, for trying to make sure that we're very clear that this is not what homeschooling is. So what they frequently will do is they'll say something like, of course every parent has the right, like the Scientific America article that you wrote a response to. They like to highlight, of course every parent should have the right to withdraw their child to homeschool. But if they're going to do that, we need to have check-ins and social worker visits and all these different steps. They need to have background checks. And they don't actually treat it like parents are in the best position to know what their child needs. They treat it like some giant conspiracy, like they're backward clods. And so they are missing, or I shouldn't say they're missing, they probably realize it. What they are trying to do, though, is put this veneer of, this is really great. Of course, we're for it, but also we don't trust them. We don't think they're providing education. We think they're all doing terrible things. And what that misses is the bigger picture of homeschooling families who are thriving, of children who are doing poorly in public school because of the social experience there, because of, the mass classes and the way education kind of gets pushed through, and are able to take their kid and say, we're going to focus on where your strengths and weaknesses are and help you figure out what you are going to be like as an adult, like the character development that goes hand in hand with the academic development in the home, which is one of the safest places for the kids.
Yeah, it's something that a lot of, I guess, people who when I read the editorial like that, so the Scientific American editorial, it didn't break any new ground. It didn't say any new thing. And it kind of suggested that, well, maybe some people it would make sense, some people who have kids with special challenges or unique talents. It was kind of harkens back to Elizabeth Bartholet's thesis that she didn't call for an outright ban. She called for a presumptive ban. And by a presumptive ban, she meant, well, there might be a handful of kids who, I could understand they maybe should be homeschooled because of, these unique challenges, or, elite athletes, or maybe movie actors, things like that. But the vast majority of parents would never qualify for what she considered to be valid exceptions. And then she said, well, parents can inculcate their kids with their values, after school and on weekends, but they should be, put in schools with the rest of the kids from 8 to 3 every day, so that the state schools can teach them. Reading, writing, arithmetic isn't really what public schools are about so much anymore. There's a lot of other stuff that goes on. And Elizabeth Bartholet, the Scientific American, ProPublica, Amazon, Joel Oliver, and on it goes. All of these media outlets who don't trust parents want the state to be able to raise kids in beliefs that a lot of parents just don't agree with. So one of the things that I remember way back when we were looking for a new staff attorney, and Amy was up in Wisconsin and travel restrictions were on, and it was hard to do interviews. And so we interviewed Amy over the Zoom window.
A thunderstorm knocked my internet out. I thought for sure they were never going to hire me after that.
Well, so my predecessor, our beloved founder, previous president, Mike Smith, I interviewed you first, and then he and I interviewed you as kind of the final interview. And he got off that interview and he just said, I can just tell she loves her parents and she loved being homeschooled. And, there's just something about kids that grew up homeschooled. And we know it's not perfect, what family is, what institution is, but so many kids value their experience growing up being homeschooled. And what do you have to say to moms and dads out there who may be considering homeschooling today, in today's world with all of its challenges and now some of this negative media spotlight?
I would say it's worth it. It's something that I'm incredibly grateful for. I have 4 younger siblings, and when the 5 of us get together, we are still such good friends, even though I'm in Virginia and most of them are in Wisconsin. It's why we're friends with our homeschooling cousins, and we're so tight. Why we're friends with you meet another homeschooler, and it's like my best friend now. But it's because there's something about being homeschooled, about getting to have the space to learn at your pace, to learn with your family, to learn, to get out and have hands-on learning. You don't always get that when you're sitting at a desk, from 8 to 3. Homeschooling, I could read in a tree. I could read, on the couch. I could do all kinds of things to keep myself engaged in the learning process. And it worked. My mom instilled in all 5 of us a love of learning, a love for the Lord, and mostly just a good relationship with my parents, with each other. We, I think, turned out pretty well.
That's something that my wife and I talk about an awful lot. We have 7 kids, all grown now, and they're all doing fine. But the thing that we value the most, that we cherish the most, is the relationships we have with them, and on into their adulthood, and now with grandchildren. My kids are all kind of like each other's best friends, and they squabble and fight, and they still do. But at the end of the day, the Mason clan sticks together, and we're always kind of in there for each other, thick or thin. And it's something that I know a lot of families experience, but I attribute homeschooling our kids to providing that kind of relationship ongoing into my kids' adult lives as well. Any last words?
We're definitely at a crossroads. I think we're going to continue to see a lot more polished pieces about homeschooling, trying to call it out. But the best thing that parents can do is just to continue to homeschool well, love your kids, work on their education, meeting them where they're at, and it'll work out. But also stay involved. Keep an eye on your legislator. Make sure you know their name. Make sure you're getting involved in your capital days. That really makes a difference. So don't stress too much, but also stay involved. It helps.
So strong family relationships and civic involvement has been kind of the the watchword for homeschoolers for all these years, and it's paid dividends in the lives of families and in rolling back the restrictive laws that would have prevented a lot of families from entering homeschooling in the years to pass. So thanks again to my guest, Amy Buchmeyer, staff attorney here at HSLDA. And this has been another episode of Homeschool Talks. We'd love to hear from you. And if you'd like to learn more about us, you can go to our website at hslda.org. We'd love to have you join HSLDA or even donate if you support the cause that we're working in. While there are challenges ahead, we are working every day to meet those challenges. And we've been here for over 40 years now, and we plan to work on the behalf of homeschoolers and homeschool freedom for many years to come. So thank you once again, Amy.
Today's program is made possible by HSLDA's legal support team. We know homeschooling isn't always easy. That's why we're committed to giving you peace of mind, so you can focus on giving your kids the best possible education. As an HSLDA member, you have access to customized legal advice from our team of attorneys to help you comply with your state's homeschool law. And will represent you if your right to homeschool is ever challenged, even in court. Every day, we help our members respond to overreaching officials, and we stand ready to defend your homeschool against unlawful attacks. To hear more about how you can enjoy a worry-free homeschool experience, visit hslda.org/join. That's hslda.org/join. Thanks for listening to this episode of Homeschool Talks. If you've enjoyed this conversation, will you do us a favor by sharing it with a friend or leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts? As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, you can sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. That's all for now. We hope you enjoyed this program, and we'll see you next time.